All right, so picture this. It's June 1944. A massive, a truly massive armada of ships is cutting through the rough waters of the English Channel. They're heading towards the French coastline, the one occupied by the Nazis. The fate of World War II is hanging in the balance at this point. But here's the thing. What if I told you that D-Day, this incredibly important operation, basically succeeded because of a really, really well-crafted lie?
It is amazing how often we just kind of think about the huge scale of D-Day, the bravery of the landings. But behind all that, there was a whole other war going on, a war of deception. It was so complex, so audacious, it actually fooled Hitler himself.
Yeah, and you sent over a whole stack of sources about this, and we were going to deep dive into exactly how the Allies managed to pull off one of the most elaborate and successful deception campaigns in history.
We'll uncover the secrets of Operation Fortitude. It was basically a giant web of lies, spun so tightly and so convincingly that it actually sent the German army chasing after phantom divisions. They were completely focused on the wrong place and had no idea about the real target, the beaches of Normandy.
We're talking about inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, even a double agent who was so good they called him Garbo.
Yeah.
This is going to be a wild ride, folks. A story of spies, subterfuge, and an incredibly high-stakes gamble that changed the entire course of the war.
Absolutely. But before we get into all the twists and turns of Operation Fortitude, we need to understand the huge obstacle the Allies were up against: the Atlantic Wall.
Yeah.
Now, this wasn't just some line drawn in the sand. This was a network of fortifications. And we're talking thousands of miles here, bristling with artillery, machine gun nests, millions of mines. It was a nightmare.
From what I've read, it seems like the Germans put a ton of resources into building this line of defense. They really saw it as the ultimate way to stop any Allied invasion.
Oh, for sure. They knew how important it was to hold on to that coastline. They saw the Atlantic Wall as like a symbol of their strength, a symbol of their determination.
So, okay, we have this seemingly unbreakable barrier in place. How did the Allies even start planning an invasion? It seems impossible.
Oh, they knew that if they went straight for the most heavily fortified parts of the Atlantic Wall, it would be a bloodbath. It would be unbelievably costly in terms of lives lost and resources used. They had to find a way to surprise the Germans, outsmart them, find a weakness somewhere.
And that's where Normandy comes into the picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of the obvious target, which would be Pas-de-Calais,
Yeah.
they went for these seemingly less defended beaches further down the coast.
Exactly. Pas-de-Calais is the closest point between England and France. Of course, it was heavily fortified. The Germans were basically waiting for the Allies to show up there. But Normandy had some tactical advantages. The beaches were longer, so you could have a wider attack. And the defenses, they were definitely weaker there, comparatively speaking.
So the Allies took a calculated risk, going for Normandy. They were gambling, but the potential payoff was bigger.
Yes, exactly. It was a gamble, but it was strategic. By choosing Normandy, they were basically using the Germans' own expectations against them. They were hoping to catch them completely off guard, making them think the invasion would happen at the most obvious spot.
Okay, so the stage is set. We have this incredible, scary Atlantic Wall. We have the strategic choice of Normandy. And then we have Operation Overlord itself, with over 156,000 troops ready to storm the beaches.
But the Allies knew they couldn't just rely on brute force. They needed something more, something smarter.
That's where strategic deception comes in. And the brains behind it. That was Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark.
Now, Clark, he wasn't exactly your typical military man, was he? He was more comfortable with theater than with, typical military tactics. He was definitely unconventional, you could say that. Clark had a background in theater, so he brought a really different perspective to war. He believed that you could create illusions, manipulate people's perceptions, and that could be just as powerful as any bomb or bullet.
And this out-of-the-box thinking led to Operation Fortitude. This was their grand plan, their big deception, to make the Germans believe that the invasion was happening somewhere else entirely. But how do you convince an entire army that something isn't happening when it is, or, even crazier, that something is happening when it's not? Seems impossible.
It does, doesn't it? It was incredibly audacious. But that's what made Operation Fortitude so brilliant. The Allies created an entire fake army group. We're talking fake tanks, fake airfields, even fake radio chatter, all designed to mislead the Germans about where the real invasion was going to be.
Wait a minute, you're telling me they had people on the radio pretending to be soldiers?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And these weren't just random, off-the-cuff transmissions. These were very carefully planned, radio plays, specifically designed to be intercepted by German intelligence. They had scripts full of military jargon, troop movements, even complaints about the weather, all to make it seem like a massive force was gathering in southeast England, ready to strike at Pas Calais.
That is amazing. They really went all out to create this illusion. They even brought General Patton into it, right?
They did. General Patton, famous for his aggressive tactics, his big personality, they put him in charge of this fictional army group. His reputation was huge. The Germans both feared and admired him.
So the thinking was, if Patton's there, it has to be the real deal.
Exactly. The Allies knew that if Patton was involved, it would make the deception way more believable. The Germans would take it seriously.
But they didn't stop there, did they? I read that they even had an actor impersonating Montgomery, and he actually fooled Montgomery's own driver.
That's right. His name was M.E. Clifton James, a not very famous actor who just happened to look a lot like Field Marshal Montgomery. They coached him to act like Montgomery, even sent him on a tour of North Africa and Gibraltar, knowing that German spies would be watching him.
It sounds like something out of a spy movie.
And it worked like a charm. The Germans were sure that Montgomery was preparing for an invasion in the Mediterranean, which of course drew their attention even further away from the real target.
Okay, so they had fake armies, fake generals, fake radio chatter. It's mind-boggling. But they must have used real spies too, right? What about double agents?
Oh, double agents played a huge role in Operation Fortitude. The British had this sophisticated system they called double cross. Basically, they would capture German spies and then use them to feed misinformation back to Berlin.
And all this happened at Camp O2, which was run by a guy called Tintai Stevens. I hear his interrogation techniques were pretty legendary.
Stevens was a master manipulator. He used a whole mix of psychological tactics to get captured spies to switch sides. He knew how to use fear, but he also understood the power of hope, and even a bit of patriotism. Many of those spies, facing execution, saw working with the British as their only way out.
Okay, we've got fake armies, fake generals, real spies turned double agents. It's an incredibly complex and daring operation. But there's one story I'm particularly eager to hear more about, and that's the chicken farmer, the one you mentioned earlier, codenamed Garbo. What can you tell us about him?
Juan Pujol Garcia, also known as Garbo. Probably the most fascinating character in this whole story. He was a Spanish chicken farmer who absolutely hated the Nazis. He wanted to do something, anything, to help the Allies. What's really amazing is that he actually went to the Germans first, offering to be a spy for them.
Wait, he went to the Germans first?
He did! He figured he could infiltrate their intelligence network and feed them bad information. The Germans, surprisingly, took him up on it, but they wanted him to operate out of London. The problem was he was in Spain and couldn't get a visa.
So what did he do? He couldn't exactly walk into the German embassy and say, hey, can you help me get to England so I can spy for you?
He had to get creative. And that's where his genius for deception really shines through. He basically invented a whole new persona, pretended to be a loyal British citizen living in London, and he started sending the Germans intelligence reports. But here's the thing. He was making it all up. He was using things like guidebooks, magazines, even train schedules to create these reports.
He was just sitting in his living room in Spain, making things up, and the Germans thought he was some top secret agent in London.
It really is incredible. It shows how creative he was, how much attention he paid to detail, but it also shows how overconfident the Germans were. And maybe a little naive about evaluating their sources. They wanted information so badly that they missed some pretty obvious problems in Garbo's reports.
Okay, so Garbo's feeding them all this made-up intel, but eventually the British find out what he's doing, right? What happened then?
At first, the British intelligence agencies, MI5 and MI6, were pretty suspicious. They thought he might be a threat, someone operating outside their control. But when they started looking into his operation, they realized he had built a huge network and had gained the Germans' trust. They saw a chance to turn him into a valuable asset.
So they recruited him, but where did they put him? They couldn't send him back to Spain? The Germans would be onto him instantly.
They brought him to London. It was a bold move. They smuggled him out of Spain and set him up in a nice house in Hendon, a suburb of London. That's where he started working directly with MI5, feeding the Germans carefully crafted misinformation.
And this is where things get even wilder, because Garbo didn't just work alone. He invented a whole network of fake sub-agents, right?
Yeah, he did. It was like a whole spy soap opera with Garbo as the mastermind. He created all these characters, a disgruntled Welshman, a gossipy secretary, a pilot with a gambling problem. They were all supposedly feeding him information from all over Britain, but of course, none of these people were real.
Wow. So he wasn't just providing false information. He created this whole elaborate cast of characters to make it seem more plausible. It's amazing the Germans never caught on. Or did they?
There were a few close calls, times when the Germans questioned Garbo's reports, but he was a master at explaining away any problems. He'd blame communication breakdowns or say his fake sub-agents were incompetent, and he used this clever technique called chicken feed.
Chicken feed. What's that?
It was basically slipping little bits of real information into his fake reports, things he got from public sources. This chicken feed made the bigger lies seem more real.
It's amazing how even a little bit of truth can be used to manipulate people. So, Garbo has the Germans completely fooled. But how does all this connect to D-Day itself? How did he convince them that the invasion was happening in the wrong place?
Well, in the early hours of June 6, 1944, just as the real invasion force was setting sail for Normandy, Garbo sent a message to his German contacts warning them that an invasion was happening.
Hold on, he actually warned them before they knew what was happening. That sounds incredibly risky.
It was a big gamble, and the timing was crucial. He made sure the message was delayed so it arrived too late for the Germans to react effectively. Plus, he knew his contacts in Madrid wouldn't get the message right away. This gave the Allies those crucial few hours to get a foothold on the beaches.
So the Germans get this warning, but by then the invasion is already underway. How did he explain that?
He pretended to be outraged. He yelled at his handlers for not being more careful, for letting down the fatherland, and then he did something brilliant. He sent another message, even longer this time, to really solidify the deception.
What did he say in this second message?
He told them with absolute confidence that the landings in Normandy were just a diversion, a feint to draw the Germans away from the real invasion site, Pas-de-Calais. He said he had insider information that a much bigger invasion force was about to hit there.
So he not only convinced them that the invasion was in the wrong place, but he also told them to keep their troops there. Did they really believe him?
They did. Intercepted German communications show that the message went straight to Hitler, and he was convinced. He was sure that a second, larger invasion was coming, so he ordered his troops to stay put, even though the Allies were already making progress in Normandy. Garbo's deception had worked perfectly.
It's unbelievable that one man, a chicken farmer no less, could have such a massive impact on history. What happened to Garbo after the war? Did he get any recognition for his incredible service?
After the war, Garbo was afraid of what might happen to him. He was worried about Nazis who might be out for revenge. So he decided to disappear. He faked his own death and moved to Venezuela. He lived there for years under a new name. Eventually, his real identity was revealed, and the British government awarded him the MBE for his amazing contribution to the Allied victory.
What an incredible story. So we've covered a lot here. Fake armies, turned spies, and a chicken farmer who outsmarted Hitler. What stands out to you the most? What's the most remarkable thing about all of this?
For me, it's just how audacious and meticulously planned the deception campaign was. The Allies, especially Dudley Clark and Juan Puchel Garcia, were masters of manipulation. They understood how the enemy thought, how to exploit their weaknesses, and they created this whole intricate illusion that helped win the war.
You're absolutely right. It really shows you that brute force isn't always the answer in war. Sometimes a well-crafted lie, executed perfectly, can be the most powerful weapon of all.
And people often forget about the role of technology and innovation in all of this. When we think of D-Day, we think about the military operation, but there was so much ingenuity going on behind the scenes, especially when it came to logistics.
Right, like those floating tanks. They weren't just inflatable toys, were they?
No, definitely not. They were specially designed tanks, officially called duplex drive tanks, or DD tanks for short. The idea was to have some armored support for the troops landing on the beaches, but tanks aren't exactly known for floating.
Let's put it mildly. So how did they get these giant metal machines to float?
It was some pretty impressive engineering. They basically fitted the tanks with these huge canvas screens that could be raised up to create a waterproof skirt around the vehicle that allowed it to float.
So they were basically giant tank-shaped boats. That is amazing. Did it work?
It was kind of a mixed bag. Some of the tanks did make it to shore and provided that much-needed support, but a lot of them sank before they even got close. Rough seas, enemy fire.
No, a valiant effort, but not entirely successful. What other innovations were there? I read something about artificial harbors. I mean, how do you build a harbor from scratch?
That's another amazing part of the story. The Allies knew they couldn't count on using existing ports, especially with places like Cherbourg being so heavily defended. So they came up with a pretty radical solution: Mulberry Harbors.
Mulberry Harbors, what are those? It sounds like something out of a children's book.
They were basically giant prefabricated harbors. The Allies towed them across the English Channel and assembled them right off the coast of Normandy.
You're kidding. They built entire harbors in England, towed them across the channel, and just dropped them on the beach.
That's exactly what they did. These things were huge, made up of concrete caissons, floating roadways, breakwaters, all designed to create a safe place for ships and landing craft. It was a truly amazing feat of engineering.
Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here. Floating tanks, artificial harbors. It's like the Allies were willing to try anything to make sure this invasion was a success. Was there anything else?
Well, there was one more project, even more ambitious than the Mulberry Harbors, and it was top secret. Have you heard of Operation Pluto?
Pluto. Like the dog. What does a cartoon dog have to do with D-Day?
Not quite. Pluto stood for Pipeline Under the Ocean. It was a super secret project to build a pipeline under the English Channel. They were pumping fuel directly from Britain to the troops in Normandy.
An underwater pipeline? Are you serious? How do they manage that?
It was an incredible engineering feat. They used special flexible pipelines, codenamed Hamel and Pluto, and laid them right across the seabed, connecting them to pumping stations on both sides of the channel.
So they were pumping fuel under the English Channel, right under the noses of the Germans.
That's right. It was risky, but it worked amazingly well. By the end of August 1944, Operation Pluto was delivering almost 1 million gallons of fuel every single day to the Allied forces in France.
Wow. It's mind-blowing to think that all this was going on while the soldiers were fighting on the beaches. So we've got the deception, the innovation, the sheer size of the operation. But let's not forget about the human element here. Those 156,000 troops landing on D-Day, they were facing incredible odds.
Oh, absolutely. The beaches were heavily defended. The Germans were ready and waiting. The casualties were enormous. But in the middle of all the chaos, all the bloodshed, there were also acts of incredible bravery and resilience.
I imagine there were so many stories of individual heroism, acts of courage that might have been lost in the bigger picture.
Absolutely. One story that always sticks with me is that of Captain Logan Scott Bowden and Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith, two British commandos who landed on Gold Beach months before the actual invasion.
What were they doing there? Scouting the area?
They were on a really important mission to collect sand samples.
Sand samples. Why was that so crucial?
The Allies needed to know if the beaches could support the weight of their tanks and other heavy equipment. The type of sand was critical. If it was too soft, the vehicles would get stuck, becoming easy targets for the Germans.
Okay, I guess the type of beach really does matter. So these two guys snuck onto a Nazi-occupied beach in the middle of the night just to grab some sand.
Exactly. They paddled ashore in this tiny boat, avoiding German patrols, braving the cold water. They filled up their sample tubes and then had to make a really daring escape back to their boat. It was a super dangerous mission, but the information they got was critical for planning the D-Day landings.
Talk about a high-stakes beach trip. They risked their lives for a few handfuls of sand. It's amazing to think about the courage it must have taken to do something like that.
It really shows you the lengths the Allies were willing to go to, the incredible attention to detail that went into planning the invasion. Every single detail mattered, even something as seemingly small as the type of sand on the beach.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just about big strategies and huge battles. It's also about these small, often overlooked acts of courage and determination.
Exactly. And it's those individual stories, those acts of bravery and sacrifice that make history come alive.
Well said. But we've only just scratched the surface here. What else can you tell us about the men who fought on D-Day? What was the makeup of the Allied forces?
Well, it was a truly diverse group. They represented so many different nations and backgrounds. You had British, American, Canadian, Free French, Polish troops, all fighting together. Each group brought their own unique skills and experience, creating a sense of camaraderie that went beyond national boundaries.
It must have been an incredible sight to see all those soldiers from all those different countries, speaking different languages, all united in their fight against a common enemy.
It was a powerful testament to the strength of alliances, the shared belief in freedom and democracy. And we can't forget the vital contributions of those who weren't on the front lines. The women who worked tirelessly in the factories, hospitals, intelligence agencies, supporting the war effort from back home.
You're right. The stories of the women who kept things running back home are just as important and often just as harrowing as those of the soldiers on the battlefield.
Absolutely. And then there were those who fought in secret behind enemy lines. The resistance fighters. They played a crucial role in disrupting German communications, sabotaging their infrastructure, gathering intelligence.
I've always been fascinated by the stories of the resistance. Ordinary people who rose up against tyranny, often at great personal risk. Their contributions to the war effort were incredibly important.
They were the eyes and ears of the Allies in occupied territory. They provided crucial information and support to the invading forces.
This is why I love these deep dives. We uncover so many layers to the story, so many different perspectives and experiences. It's not just about dates and battles, it's about the people who lived through them, the choices they made, the sacrifices they endured.
It's about understanding the human cost of war, recognizing the incredible courage and resilience of those who fought for a better future. And in the case of D-Day, it's also about appreciating the incredible lengths they went to deceive the enemy and secure that victory. It really is amazing when you think about all the different people involved in D-Day. We tend to focus on the soldiers landing on the beaches, but the Allied forces were like a microcosm of society.
Right, you had young guys, barely adults, fighting alongside veterans who had seen it all, farmers, factory workers, teachers, artists, all united for this one purpose.
And it wasn't just a British and American operation either. We're talking about a truly global force.
Yeah, a real multinational effort.
Exactly. Canadians were crucial in securing Juno Beach. Then you had the Free French forces, desperate to liberate their homeland, fighting bravely on Sword Beach. Polish troops who had escaped Nazi occupation were also instrumental in several key battles. And let's not forget all the people from occupied nations who served in support roles. They risked their lives to help the Allied cause.
It just shows you how far-reaching the conflict was, how World War II impacted so many lives. It drew people from all over the world into this fight against tyranny.
It really does. It reminds us that the desire for freedom is universal. And D-Day was a pivotal moment in securing that freedom for so many people. But while the soldiers on the front lines were doing the most dangerous work, we can't forget about the people who supported them from behind the scenes. The unsung heroes.
You're talking about the women who stepped up to fill all those essential roles back home.
Exactly. Millions of men were off fighting, so women took on jobs that were traditionally done by men. They worked in factories, shipyards, offices.
From what I've read, their contributions were essential to the Allied victory. And they faced their own challenges too, working long hours in tough conditions, all while worrying about their loved ones overseas.
Their resilience was amazing. They faced discrimination, societal pressures, yet they persevered. They proved just how strong they were in so many ways. And we can't forget the women who actually served in the armed forces. Nurses, ambulance drivers, code breakers.
Their stories often get overshadowed by all the stories of battlefield heroism, but their contributions were just as important.
Absolutely. And speaking of unsung heroes, we also have to talk about the resistance movements in occupied Europe. These brave individuals, operating in secret and putting themselves in incredible danger, played a crucial role in fighting the Nazi war machine.
I've always been so fascinated by the stories of the resistance. They were ordinary people, shopkeepers, teachers, farmers, who risked everything to fight for their freedom. What kind of things did they do?
They were involved in all sorts of activities, gathering intelligence, sabotaging infrastructure, helping Allied airmen escape capture.
So they were disrupting German communications, providing safe houses, spreading anti-Nazi propaganda.
Exactly. They were fighting a shadow war, constantly harassing the Nazi occupiers.
Right.
Their efforts, often with very limited resources and facing brutal reprisals, were incredibly important. They weakened the German grip on occupied Europe and helped pave the way for the Allied liberation.
It's hard to imagine the courage it took to operate in such dangerous conditions. They were true patriots, fighting for their countries and their beliefs, even when the odds were stacked against them.
It's a testament to the human spirit, the desire for freedom even when facing oppression. Their contributions to the Allied victory were absolutely crucial.
It's amazing how this deep dive into D-Day has revealed so many layers to the story. We're going beyond the typical narrative of soldiers and battles and seeing a much wider picture of the human experience.
It's a reminder that history is made up of countless individual stories, all woven together to create the larger narrative. And by looking at these individual stories, we can understand just how complex and significant events like D-Day really are.
It's also fascinating to think about D-Day's legacy, how this event still shapes our world today. What are your thoughts on that?
D-Day was a turning point in World War II. It shifted the balance of power to the Allies and set the stage for the liberation of Europe. But it was also a turning point in human history, a testament to the power of international cooperation and the willingness of ordinary people to stand up against tyranny.
It also serves as a reminder of how fragile peace is and how important it is to protect our freedoms.
Absolutely. The lessons of D-Day are just as relevant today as they were back then. It's a story of courage, sacrifice, innovation, and the unwavering belief in a better future.
Well said. Now, I know you're a big film buff. I'm curious to get your take on how D-Day has been portrayed in movies over the years. Have you seen any films that you think really captured the essence of the event?
There have been a lot of movies about D-Day, some better than others. But one that stands out for its realism is Saving Private Ryan. The opening scene, the landings on Omaha Beach, is incredibly powerful, really harrowing.
I've heard that Steven Spielberg, the director, really wanted to make that scene as authentic as possible. He even used veterans as consultants.
He did, and you can tell. The chaos, the fear, the brutality of the fighting, it's all captured with incredible intensity. It's a tough scene to watch, but it gives you a real sense of what those soldiers went through on those beaches.
It's important to remember that films, while they can be entertaining and even informative, are still works of fiction. They often play fast and loose with historical accuracy to make the story more dramatic.
Oh, definitely. You always have to watch historical films with a critical eye. Their interpretations, not necessarily the absolute truth.
So, what are some of the common myths or misconceptions about D-Day that you've come across?
One common misconception is that D-Day was a purely American effort. While American troops played a huge role, it was a multinational operation. British, Canadian, and Free French forces were all key players.
Right. And as we talked about earlier, the landings happened on 5 different beaches, each with its own challenges and strategic importance.
Exactly. It's important to recognize the contributions of all the allied nations involved, not just focus on the American perspective.
Another myth I've heard is that the beaches were completely undefended, that the Allies just walked right in.
That couldn't be further from the truth. The Germans had heavily fortified the coastline, machine gun nests, artillery batteries, minefields. The fighting on those beaches was intense, and both sides suffered heavy casualties.
It really underscores the fact that D-Day, while a triumph for the Allies, came at a tremendous cost.
Absolutely. We have to remember the human cost of this victory. Honor the memory of those who fought and died on those beaches.
Another thing that movies often have trouble showing is the sheer scale of D-Day. Hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of ships, an air armada unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was a logistical feat of unprecedented proportions.
It's hard to wrap your head around just how massive it was, even if you've studied it a lot. It was a global event, and its effects are still being felt today.
Well said.
Huh.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into D-Day, what are the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to think about? What's the lasting message of this historical event?
For me, it's a story about courage, ingenuity, and resilience. It reminds us what humans are capable of, both good and bad. And it shows the importance of fighting for what you believe in, even when the odds are stacked against you.
It's also about the power of deception, how important intelligence gathering is, and how crucial international cooperation is when facing tyranny.
And maybe most importantly, it's a reminder that peace is fragile and that we always have to be vigilant in defending our freedoms.
Beautifully put. And before we finish up, I have to ask, after all the research you've done, all these incredible stories you've uncovered, is there anything that surprised you? Something you didn't know before?
Honestly, I was blown away by how audacious the deception campaign was, the lengths the Allies went to fool the Germans. It's mind-boggling. It shows how creative they were, their attention to detail, and their understanding of human psychology.
It really is incredible. It's one thing to come up with a plan, but to execute it so perfectly on such a massive scale? It's amazing.
And for me, it highlights the importance of critical thinking, questioning assumptions, challenging conventional wisdom. The Allies, especially people like Dudley Clark, weren't afraid to think differently, to try new things, and that's what made all the difference.
Exactly. So to wrap up this amazing deep dive, what's one thing you want our listeners to walk away thinking about, something they can ponder on their own?
I think it's this. What if the deception had failed? What if the Germans had seen through the whole thing? How would the war have been different? How would history have changed? It's a scary thought, but it shows just how crucial the events we've been talking about really were.
Wow. That's definitely something to think about. And it makes me appreciate the sacrifices made by those who fought on D-Day even more. They secured our freedom, and we can't forget that.
Well said.
It really does make you think, doesn't it? What if it had all gone wrong? What if the Germans had been ready for them on those beaches? It's a pretty sobering thought.
It really shows you how crucial D-Day was, not just as a military victory, but as a turning point in the whole war, the moment things started going the Allies' way.
And it makes you wonder about the long-term impact of D-Day, too. I mean, we've talked about the immediate results like liberating Europe and eventually defeating Nazi Germany. But how did this one event shape the world we live in today?
Well, in a lot of ways, D-Day set the stage for the entire post-war world. It cemented the alliance between the US and Europe, which led to things like NATO and a whole new era of countries working together. It also really sped up the decline of colonialism. The war had weakened the European powers, and all these independence movements around the world started gaining momentum.
So D-Day wasn't just about freeing Europe. It was about changing the whole global landscape for decades to come.
Exactly. It set off a chain reaction of events. You have the creation of the United Nations, the Marshall Plan, the Cold War, all of which have had a huge impact on the world we live in today.
It's pretty mind-blowing to think that something that happened almost a century ago can still have such a ripple effect. It makes you wonder if there are any lessons we can learn from D-Day that still apply in the 21st century.
Oh, there are definitely lessons there, both strategic and moral ones. On a strategic level, it shows how important it is to plan things out carefully, to have decisive leadership, and to be willing to take risks, but calculated risks.
And that whole deception campaign, how they managed to outsmart the Germans, that's a lesson in itself.
Definitely. It shows you the power of good intelligence, of understanding your enemy's weaknesses and knowing how to use them against them. It also highlights the importance of innovation, finding creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems, like those Mulberry Harbors and the Pluto pipeline.
Right. But beyond the strategic stuff, there are also some really important moral lessons from D-Day, too.
Absolutely. D-Day is a stark reminder of the cost of war, the huge sacrifices made by those who fought for freedom. It also reminds us how important it is for countries to work together, to stand united against tyranny and oppression.
And maybe most importantly, it reminds us that peace is something we can lose, and we need to be constantly vigilant in protecting our freedoms.
Well said. The events of D-Day, even though they happened so long ago, are still incredibly relevant to us. They remind us of the courage and sacrifice of those who came before us, and they inspire us to work towards a world where these kinds of conflicts are a thing of the past.
This has been an amazing journey, a powerful reminder of how history can teach us, inspire us, and challenge us to think critically about the world we live in. Thank you so much for taking us through this fascinating and complex story.
It's been a pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the past.
Yeah.
We hope it sparked your curiosity and encouraged you to learn more about this crucial moment in history. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll be exploring another amazing chapter from history. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.